Welcome to the channels, ladies, gentlemen, lizard people, and variants thereupon. If you're new here, my name is Weebo Jones, and this year's Halloweeb special will be discussing that which apparently lives rent-free in the minds of many adult human males. You've probably seen it in recent months, the TikTok trend of women asking their partners how often they think about the Roman Empire.
How often do you think about the Roman Empire?
I thought about it yesterday, I thought about it today, but I probably don't think about it every day, probably like every other day maybe.
How often do you think about the Roman Empire? Daily?
Not daily, but times a week, I don't know.
How often would you say you think about the Roman Empire?
How many times a week did I think about the Roman Empire? Once a week.
How often do you think about the Roman Empire?
Like once every 2 months.
For you. How often do you think of the Roman Empire?
Twice a month.
How often do you think about the Roman Empire?
Pretty consistently.
You're kidding.
No.
Apparently, men think an awful lot about the Roman Empire. And this is obviously spurred a subgenre of memes where people propose their own Roman Empire equivalences, usually in response to the question, what is my Roman Empire? Honestly, it's not that hard to gauge why the Roman Empire specifically lives rent-free in the minds of so many. 15 words or less, simply put, the Roman Empire has had an enduring legacy that impacts our lives today. And while Rome and its many accomplishments are impressive on their own, and I could probably go on to make an entire 3-hour-long documentary series regarding it, I have not the time. But also, I think it's more compelling for us to take a step back from the recognizable and impressive pomp and circumstance that was the Roman legions, its emperors, senate, road, etc., to examine that which made its legacy possible in the first place. And we're better to start an analysis of a thing than with the thing's genesis. It is said that the semi-divine son of Venus, Prince Aeneas, fled the sacking of the ancient city of Troy following the war in search of a new homeland. After much shenanigans abroad, Aeneas and co. eventually arrived in Italy, and the exiled prince set to work forming alliances with the locals by marrying the king of Latium's daughter Lavinia, uniting the native Latins with the exiled Trojans. He went on to found a new city called Lavinium. Much later, a series of wars had ensued against other locals, which resulted in Aeneas, or at least his people, gaining control of the Alban Hills and surrounding areas. Following Aeneas' death, his son Ascanius would go on to found the city of Alba Longa. Several generations later, his many great-grandsons Numitor and Aemilius had been co-ruling Alba Longa when Aemilius decided to depose his brother Numitor. In an effort to end his brother's line of succession once and for all, Aemilius killed Numitor's son and condemned his daughter Rhea Silvia to the greatest suffering one could possibly imagine, perpetual virginity. An effort that would ultimately prove to be futile, as in the classic Hellenistic tradition of the gods, the Roman god of war, Mars, would eventually visit Rhea Silvia, and either through seduction or Rhea Silvia would fall pregnant with twins. Upon their birth, Aemilius ordered the twins Romulus and Remus to be abandoned in a basket on the river Tiber. The river carried the basket to the foot of Palatine Hill, where they were found by a she-wolf who suckled them until they were later found by a shepherd who adopted them and raised them with his wife. As the twins grew into men, they eventually learned of their royal heritage and plotted against their uncle, intent on restoring their grandfather Numitor to the throne. Having kept their uncle dead, they decided then to establish their own city on the banks of the Tiber River. It was then that a dispute arose between the brothers over the city's location and name. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill, while Remus preferred the Aventine Hill, and in classic Roman fashion, their disagreement would ultimately lead to Romulus doing a murder about it on his former roommate. According to legend, on April 21st, 753 BC, Romulus became the sole founder and ruler of the city he would name for himself, Rome. To pad his population numbers, Romulus offered asylum to fugitives, exiles, and outcasts to join him in building his new city, which, funnily enough, resulted in a dominantly male population. To solve this problem, Romulus invited the Sabines from neighboring settlements to intermarry their women with the barely established Roman population, an offer that was, not surprisingly, declined. But Romulus, ever the entrepreneur, had a backup plan. If the Sabines would not send their women to his people willingly, the Romans would simply take the Sabine women unwillingly. An idea that, in practice, did not much endear the Romans to the Sabine king. Titus Tatius quickly counter-raided to retrieve the taken Sabine womenfolk, but surprisingly, the Sabine women insisted the two sides just kiss and make up about it, because war kills people. So the two kings, Romulus and Titus, ended up co-ruling the newly united Romans and Sabines until Titus's death 5 years later. According to legend, Romulus reigned for nearly 38 years after that, and is credited with the origin of several Roman features of state. Specifically, the formation of an advisory council which would eventually morph into the Roman Senate. At some point in the annals of history, Romulus disappears, and it is assumed that he was just whisked off to become a god, I guess. Too long didn't read. Romulus murking his own brother happens to be the most etymologically significant fratricide in all of history. The foundational myth of Rome itself is one of betrayal, fratricide, mass abduction, war, and this much is true, but oddly enough, it's also riddled with themes of integration, appropriation, and ascendancy. What I mean by that is that the Romans demonstrated a distinct pride and a surprising willingness, considering the time, to integrate outsiders, appropriate their ideas, and enable them to socially ascend within the framework of their body of government, as is made evident throughout what I feel comfortable classifying as an origin story. Take Aeneas, for example. Aeneas led his people around the Mediterranean looking for a new homeland, eventually settling in Italy and ingratiating himself and his people with the locals, marrying the daughter of one of the kings of ancient Italy. And then we can't forget Romulus, the adopted son of a shepherd who goes on to found his own city in which he accepted fugitives, exiles, and outcasts. Eventually, he even granted asylum to his enemy, as equal partners in his new Roman state. Mythology or truth, the Romans believed this to be their genesis. It was their history, their national identity. But it was also a point of contention amongst ancient scholarship. Several alternative versions of the tale or the origin of Rome crop up in the primary sources throughout the duration of Rome's tenure as a superpower. There's a version of the tale where Remus dies in a riot between him and his brother's supporters. There's another where Remus survives to found his own settlement on Aventine Hill. In fact, Virgil's own national epic, the Aeneid, was written following the rise of Rome's first emperor, Caesar Augustus, with the express intention of providing a more grand and more dignified origin story, fit for the glory of Rome, meant to eclipse any previous mythos that might have been permeating among the plebs. Ultimately, this one was a failure, but they still tried. The Romulus and Remus story was carved so deeply into the bedrock of Rome, not because the twins were any more real than Virgil's Aeneid story was, but because the story of Romulus and Remus were a manifestation of Rome's own national identity. And that national identity was Rome before everything. The legendary founder, Romulus, is merely the example set forth that all Roman citizens must strive to exemplify in their day-to-day lives. A good Roman citizen must sacrifice his familial ties, trespass on his neighbor, devastate his foes, ally himself with despots, and commit fratricide for that which leads to the glory of Rome. Sacrifice everything, including your own life, for the glory of Rome. This theme of sacrifice anything and everything is something that crops up in the annals of Roman history time and time again. Roman expansion, for instance, only came at the cost of not just her enemies, but at the cost of quite literally millions of Roman soldiers, who consistently and enthusiastically threw their own bodies at the problem of the day, sometimes recklessly, in service of Rome. Probably one of the best examples of such a thing would be the Second Punic War, which saw Rome's victory over Carthage following an utterly devastating defeat at Cannae in 216 BC, to the tune of 55 to 70,000 dead Romans, it's estimated. Even after such a devastating loss, the Romans still managed to throw enough people fodder at the problem that was Hannibal's army to make a difference. An effort that, when coupled with what was largely regarded as a suicidal counteroffensive in Spain and North Africa by Scipio to cut off Hannibal's supply, effectively decimated Carthage, ensuring they would never truly recover. Rome's own republican institutions, as the Romans would tell it, came at the cost of deposing a tyrant, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, which was an uprising spearheaded by Tarquinius' own relations. His cousin, his nephew, and his cousin-in-law. Following the coup, Brutus and Collatinus would take up the positions of elected co-consul, vowing never again to tolerate a king in Rome, and to kill anyone who ever attempted to restore the monarchy. Ever. At all. And they were dead serial about this, bro. Because when it was revealed that Brutus' own son and his brothers-in-law plotted to do just that, Brutus ordered the death of his own relations. Following that, nearly 500 years after this, we get the most famous assassination in all of history, the death of Julius Caesar. You see, the Roman Senate believed that after Caesar had declared himself dictator for life, they were fast approaching the downfall of the Republic and the reestablishment of a monarchy, which is a big no-no in Rome. So, a conspiracy against Julius Caesar was launched on the 22nd of February, 44 BC, where Cassius Longinus and his brother-in-law Marcus Brutus began to exact their plot against the trouble that was Julius Caesar. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Caesar would enter the Senate, where he was thusly surrounded and stabbed 23 times by the, quote, best men of Rome. A list which included Marcus Junius Brutus, the son of Caesar's most favorite mistress, Servilia, said to be very dear to Caesar, and whom Caesar even had pardoned in the aftermath of the civil war against Pompey. Then there was Gaius Cassius, whom Caesar had also pardoned, and then Decimus, whom Caesar loved as a son, enough so to name him as the heir in the second decree of his will. Despite all their efforts, the conspiring senators did not save the Republic, and ultimately Rome did receive her king in everything but name. Finally, the empire that had been forming slowly but surely over the course of the Republic had its emperor, in the form of Caesar Augustus. So, what made Rome great? Well, I would posit that one of the primary factors that made Rome such a big deal in the ancient world was its own people's buy-in to the Roman project, and their willingness to sacrifice in service of it. I would further argue that a large part of the impetus behind the collapse of Rome itself was the preponderance of powerful individuals to follow Caesar, usually emperors or generals, who fancied the prestige of the position of the laurels over the responsibility of maintaining and building Rome's legacy. You see, after the fall of the Republic, Roman expansion eventually stagnated. Roman institutions that had been the backbone of the Republic found themselves crippled by the transfer of responsibilities. We have several examples of incompetent and oftentimes insane emperors who would come to be assassinated, sometimes by their own Praetorian Guard. And that was something that happened enough time to warrant an entire Wikipedia page. The Roman currency was debased, with lesser valuable metals tanking its value. The crisis of the 3rd century saw the empire partitioned into factions and then repartitioned into other factions on the whims of Romans with just enough glory and yes men surrounding them to get it into their heads that they might make a good emperor. An idea that instigated many civil wars, skirmishes, and sackings of the city of Rome. You know, the works. Following Constantine's reconquering of Rome from his rival Tetrarchs, he established an eastern capital that would eventually become Constantinople, relying on foreign mercenaries for Rome's defenses, rather than those parties with the most investment into Roman culture. Eventually, those external military forces that had been displaced by the Huns had integrated themselves into Roman military and politics enough that their interests eclipsed that of the native Roman interests. A few sackings of the city of Rome, the permanent division of the west and eastern halves of the empire, and finally the dissolution of Rome's western influence was what ultimately put the once glorious, although long-suffering wolf of the Mediterranean out of its misery, once and for all, killing it dead. You know that stupid meme about hard times creating strong men, and strong men creating good times, and good times creating weak men, and weak men creating hard times repeat ad infinitum? Well, I think I can finally appreciate what it's trying to get at. Having done an obnoxious amount of research for this video, and an obnoxious amount of thinking about what I wanted this video to be. The strength that comes from hard times isn't so much referring to muscles or physiques. Duh. There is a certain conviction that gets cultivated in the hearts of those that toil through the hard times. It's a singular motivator that tells these people that they are doing what is necessary to build a world that they can, in good conscience, hand off to those that follow after them. And it's the what is necessary part of that which is key, because sometimes that refers to sacrificing for your ideals, whether that be your loyalties to your country, to friends, to brother, or even your own personal bodily constitution. If enough people going through a hard time find the what is necessary to be compelling enough, it can unify a force capable of packing quite a wallop. That strength of men refers to the masses, unified by a singular purpose. It's only in the aftermath, during the good times, when the fighting shifts from a singular purpose to a person's singular interest, that we encounter the weakest men and the subsequent disillusion of good times. Rinse, repeat. I know it seems counterintuitive that I would surmise humanity is at its strongest when we're most willing to sacrifice those seemingly closest to us for the cause. But as the saying goes, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. In layman's terms, this means that those relationships that you forge for yourself do oftentimes become more important than the ones that are thrust upon you by circumstance. The Roman project is an excellent study of human nature at its greatest and at its most terrible. It's that duality that I find to be the most compelling point of intrigue, worth analyzing for the lessons we can take away when it comes to Rome. Roman military conquests, its Colosseum, the aqueducts and roads, the philosophy and the Senate are not where Rome derived its greatness from. Rather, they're just the happy consequences of Rome's unique ability to unite conquered citizens in the service of the idea of the success that was this Roman project. So, I'll end my video with a question that I hope holds a new meaning to everyone here. What is your Roman Empire? And so, in conclusion, Carthage must be destroyed.